Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second book talk that we're sponsoring here at the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. I am John Moss. I'm on the programs and education staff at the museum, and we're very fortunate this evening to have with us our guest, Marc Gallicchio, who has written a wonderful book about the end of World War II in the Pacific called Unconditional. And we're going to be talking with him about that book and some of the main points that he makes in there, how he wrote it, and some of his opinions about the book. So again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. So let me start out by introducing Marc and telling you a little bit about him. Dr. Gallicchio is professor of history at Villanova University and was a Fulbright visiting lecturer in Japan from 1998 to 1999 and 2004 to 2005. He received his PhD in history from Temple University. He is the author of The Scramble for Asia, U.S. Military Power in the Aftermath of the Pacific War, and is co-author of Implacable Foes, War in the Pacific, 1944 to 1945, which won the prestigious Bancroft Prize in History. So welcome, Marc, and we're glad to have you talk about your new book.
Well, thank you, John. Be here.
Okay, well, let's start with kind of a broad picture of what you've about your topic that you wrote about, and then this notion of unconditional surrender and how that influenced the end of World War II in Japan. So can you give us a brief overview of your thesis in the book?
Oh, sure. One of the main themes in the book is that unconditional surrender was meant to be the first step in dealing with the defeated Axis powers, that it wasn't simply an objective in and of itself. What I try to show in the book is that that policy became very controversial in the summer of 1945, and it exposed the kind of ideological and partisan cleavage within the American government. There were divisions within this coalition government that Roosevelt had put together to win the war. And you could see that beginning to come out in a debate over unconditional surrender in 1945. And what I show there is the way in which that debate, as things often do in Washington, spilled out into the public with people leaking information and the like and trying to influence popular opinion, one way or another on the issue of unconditional surrender. So I look at it as, my point is domestic politics didn't end with the war. And in fact, they became even more intense as the war drew to a close.
Good. Okay, thanks. So let's get a little bit more specific as we start talking here. The idea of an unconditional surrender was not really worked out by the Allies formally until FDR announced it at one of the conferences. Is that right? And why did this happen so informally instead of worked out among the Allies and the staff?
Well, the short answer to that is because that's how Roosevelt did a lot of things. Yeah, he announced it at the Casablanca conference. Now, it did have an ad hoc feel to it, announced it. But in fact, the planning bureaucracy that Roosevelt had created in the United States, even before the war began, had determined that unconditional surrender ought to be one of the Allied goals. And Roosevelt discussed that with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the way over to Casablanca. And then when he met with Prime Minister Winston Churchill, they discussed it, and Churchill forwarded the idea to his cabinet, and they approved.
Mm.
Now Churchill subsequently said, well, Roosevelt just sort of sprung it on me at a press conference. And as with many things that Churchill wrote in his memoirs, they later had to be corrected. That's putting it gently.
Right. Interesting. And this notion of unconditional surrender kind of has a little bit of a track record in U.S. military history, right? It wasn't the first time that term had been used in American history.
Well, of course, Roosevelt, in this very brief conference he had, told reporters, he said, well, Ulysses S. Grant, in fact, he was known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, and because he had issued that demand at Fort Donelson in the Civil War. But his idea of unconditional surrender had nothing to do with this, what Grant's involvement in it. And in fact, the more recent example had been the end of World War I, where Republicans led by Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge had demanded that Woodrow Wilson compelled Germany's unconditional surrender. And of course, Wilson settled on a peace that was supposed to be based on the 14 points. And Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, to see firsthand, the political fallout from that. And he assumed that, or hoped that by, declaring that unconditional surrender was an American war aim, he would preempt Republican criticism on that score. That wasn't, that didn't happen.
Right.
But that was certainly a motive in his thinking.
Okay. Yeah. So toward the end of the war, July or June, July, and early August, this is starting to factor into Allied plans and the mechanism of the surrender. And since Germany had already surrendered by those months, by the summer months, there started to be another factor involved, which was the Soviet Union. So what did the Soviets' entry into the war against Japan have to do with unconditional surrender?
Well, the Allies, the Joint Chiefs, advised Roosevelt that Soviet assistance would be needed to clear the Japanese out of Northeast Asia, so that the Americans wouldn't have to be involved, landing troops in China. And Roosevelt, went to Yalta to secure Stalin's pledge to enter the war in timely fashion to aid the Americans, and it was believed that would help compel Japan's unconditional surrender. By the time Germany surrendered, however, Soviet movement into Central Europe alarmed a lot of American officials who worried that they might see something similar, that the Russians might enter Manchuria and not leave, right? If they came into the war. And so they began to question whether Russian assistance was really necessary to defeat Japan, especially since, Germany was already defeated and Japan was sort of out there alone by itself. And these people argued maybe there'd be a way to induce Japan to surrender, modify unconditional surrender. The advocates, people like Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew, for example, and some people in the Navy argued, let's, as they put it, clarify unconditional surrender so the Japanese know that they can keep the emperor in place. And that's really that'll be fine with us. The Japanese will surrender. And some of these people, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, President Roosevelt's chief military advisor, Admiral Leahy, they didn't even think an occupation of Japan would be necessary for the war. They thought, you could isolate Japan militarily and that would be sufficient. So they began to believe that if you modified American war aims, you could end the war more quickly and you wouldn't have to deal with the repercussions of Soviet entry into the war. So that's how that thinking began to coalesce. And of course, there was a great deal of pressure domestically to do something to end the war quickly, because no sooner had Germany surrendered than the United States Army in particular began this partial demobilization of troops. And that only increased people's impatience, GIs in Europe, but their families back home, and then their congressional representatives, to try and speed up that demobilization process and get people home as quickly as possible. So you really have a convergence of factors that were putting pressure on the new president, Harry Truman, to find a way of ending the war.
Got it.
And, it was sort of strategic, and it was domestic politics all coming together.
Okay, we're going to pull up a couple slides here. The first one being FDR and Churchill at Casablanca that we talked about, and they had a working relationship about the surrender of both Germany and Japan. That was, here's a colorized version of that image. And let's go to the next one right away here. We also have our friend Joseph Stalin, who was interested in geopolitics and what happened at the end of the war. And we were just talking about Stalin and how the Soviets influenced this notion of unconditional surrender and the end of the war. Why was the U.S. Navy opposed to conditional surrender?
Well, basically, as I feel as though, since this is an Army event, I can speak freely here. He, of course, had planned for years to fight Japan and to defeat the Japanese Navy. And the sort of thinking was that once they had defeated the Japanese Navy, then Japan would not pose a threat to the United States any longer, that it could be isolated and forced to surrender through bombardment and blockade, basically a siege. The problem with that, from the perspective of the Army and Army Chief of Staff General Marshall, was that he believed that such a strategy would take too long and that the American public would grow weary of this sort of prolonged campaign against Japan and be willing to settle for something less than unconditional surrender. The Navy, basically, their thinking was that wouldn't be a disaster because, after all, Japan, they argued, wouldn't pose a threat again to the peace. So you had a kind of competing visions of what constituted victory. And but the Navy really didn't have a way of producing Japan's unconditional surrender in a timely fashion. And so what they decided to do was basically call for a modification of that war aim to be within reach of what the Navy was capable of.
So you hit on this a little bit in the first question, but can you tell us why, Mark, that this notion of retaining the Japanese monarchy was so important to Japan and really affected how the U.S. Looked at surrender, how they recognized that it was an important potential stumbling block to any negotiations. How did the emperor fit into all this?
Sure. The people who were advocating modification of unconditional surrender argued that the emperor was a figurehead in Japan, maybe likened to the British monarch, but was not politically significant. And these people, like Undersecretary of State Joseph Grew, Henry Stimson, who complained, that people who wanted unconditional surrender, he said, the only thing they know about Japan was, from Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado,
Right.
And whereas Stimson and Grew had considerable experience in the Far East and with Japan, Grew, who had been ambassador to Japan for 10 years. And so they were arguing from their expertise that you could let the Japanese keep the emperor if you got rid of the militarists who were responsible, they thought, for Japan's aggression. Then the emperor would, the institution could be used to kind of stabilize Japan in a post-war period and become a symbol of a new Japan. In fact, the emperor played a more significant role in modern Japanese history than Grew and Stimson understood or appreciated. Ever since the Meiji Restoration, the emperor had been used by the Japanese elite, the people who really governed Japan, as this sort of focal point of Japanese nationalism and as a way of fending off democratic reform within Japan. So it was a kind of bulwark, the institution of the monarchy, against reform within Japan all through the first half, the late half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. The emperor was not a constitutional monarch in the way that the King of England was. His role was more significant than that. And, the military reported directly to the emperor. The emperor was used to mobilize Japanese society when Japan was modernizing after the Meiji Restoration. And it was kind of had the same kind of zeal as a sort of wartime mobilization as Japan tried to catch up with the West. And the emperor, the leaders of Japan used the emperor as a rallying point for that. Now, Hirohito, he was much more involved in and aware of what the Japanese military was doing than either Grew or Stimson appreciated at the time. So he had this interesting discussion of going on internally of Japanese history. People were actually they had disagreements about the trajectory of modern Japanese history. And some people said, well, you get rid of the militarists, and Japan had been peaceful in the 1920s, and they referred to the leaders of Japan as liberals or moderates, and it would return to that, they said. Whereas the people who supported unconditional surrender said, no, you have to do a lot more than that. You've got to sort of, tear Japanese militarism and autocracy out by the roots. That starts with the monarchy. It doesn't end there, right? That's why not was necessary.
Okay. Let's pull up, we have a slide of President Truman. Let's go to that for a second here. And let me ask you a question on Truman. Did you feel, or does your research show, or that President Truman, did he use the atomic bombs to get the Japanese to surrender before the Soviets got into the war against Japan?
No, I mean, of course, this is a huge debate that continues to this day, but I am on the side, I mean, that believes, Truman used the atomic bombs to end the war as quickly as possible, and that's why they were built, and that's what they were expected to do. However, at sort of the 11th hour, the possibility that using the atomic bombs would put the United States in a better position, against the Russians, that became kind of a bonus for using the atomic bombs, but it wasn't decisive. It didn't. The Russians didn't factor into his calculation of whether to use it, because he was committed to unconditional surrender. And in fact, here's, one of the, I thought, interesting points that I uncovered in my research is, that it's commonly thought that that if Truman wanted to end the war, he used the atomic bombs. Well, in fact, if he wanted to end the war, he would have listened to Grew and Stimson and modified unconditional surrender. Want to do that. For Truman, unconditional surrender was the most important objective in the war, and certainly he worried about the Russians, but not to the point where he was going to let that interfere with the main objective of securing Japan's unconditional surrender. And part of the reason for that is, Truman, Joseph Grew met with Truman 3 times, trying to explain to him the situation. I refer to it as, Grew was sort of mansplaining Japanese history to Harry Truman. And each time Truman would sort of nod and give some tentative approval, but in the end, he rejected Grew's recommendations about making a promise to the Japanese on the emperor. And that's because we know now, Truman felt, he said, Hirohito is as guilty as Mussolini and Hitler. That wasn't true either, but it was closer, I think, to understanding Hirohito's role than Grew and Stimson were. Yeah.
And prior to FDR's death, was Truman kept in the loop much on the thinking about unconditional surrender, or was this one of these aspects that all of a sudden he's president and gets a new briefing and there he is?
The latter. He was aware, of course, of the public dimensions of unconditional surrender after 1943 and how it was repeated. In fact, his first address to Congress, he says that the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers remains America's primary objective in the war, and he noted that was the line that got the greatest applause in that speech. Right, so that reinforced his appreciation for that as a war aim. But I'll here just sort of, if you don't mind, I just there was more than sort of public opinion or fear of public opinion driving Truman and reinforcing his insistence on unconditional surrender. We see at the end of the war, Truman reiterates, even after Japan surrendered, that the American occupation of Japan is premised on Japan's unconditional surrender. And he says, that's so we can enact this, detailed, well-developed reform program in Japan that's meant to eliminate Japanese militarism. So he was aware of that too. In other words, he understood that unconditional surrender was the first step in dealing with Japan. It wasn't an end in itself.
And you just mentioned that it wasn't just public opinion, it influenced him. Let's bring up the next slide. There were also some other powerful political leaders on the home front that also were trying to influence him, including former President Herbert Hoover. Can you tell us a little bit about Truman and Hoover? I got the feeling from your book that Truman oftentimes couldn't wait to see Hoover's back going out the door after these meetings, and really wasn't all that interested in getting Hoover's advice.
Well, he certainly wasn't. Hoover, this is the first time, of course, he had been in Washington since Roosevelt had become president, and he was keen to give Truman advice on almost everything. I mean, Truman met with him and wanted to talk about the food situation in Europe at the end of the war. I mean, Hoover had, after all, reputation in that area. World War I.
Right.
But Hoover offered his advice on lots of other things, including how to end the war with Japan. And he told Truman, look, just ignore public opinion. The vengeful minority, as he referred to those people who wanted unconditional surrender, and do the right thing and compromise with Japan. Well, I note that Truman might have respected Hoover's opinion on a lot of things, but politics probably wasn't one of them. And he wasn't about to sort of take Hoover's advice on this.
Right.
Hoover sent him a memo that Truman circulated within his cabinet for advice. But in the end, he does not make that statement that Hoover wanted him to make and that Grew wanted him to make, in which he would, promise the Japanese they could keep the emperor. He always stopped with that. Yeah.
Well, let's pull up the next slide here. Now that you mentioned the emperor, this is one image of Emperor Hirohito, and who had been on the, I guess you would call it the throne, for how many years before the war?
I'm going to say it was late 1928. I mean, he became emperor, and then there was a large coronation ceremony that took place like 2 years after. So I'm embarrassed to say
that's okay.
All the date at this moment, late 1920s, but yeah, I mean, his American biographer makes the point that that he was more involved in and aware of the military's actions, and that he declined to intervene when his input might have redirected the course of Japanese military actions, and that he really, in the summer of 45, prolonged the war because he insisted on trying to avoid surrender. Americans were reading Japanese diplomatic traffic, and they could see that the Japanese, at the behest of the emperor, were seeking the help of the Russians to end the war, but they talked about peace. They never talked about surrender.
Right.
And as it turns out, keeping the emperor was the most important of their demands, but they also wanted, they didn't want an occupation. They wanted the Allies to forego an occupation. The Japanese military wanted to try its own war criminals and disarm its own troops. I mean, those were all demands that the Japanese military were making at the time.
So when do you think that Hirohito realized that there was not going to be a victory against the United States?
Oh, I think he knew that certainly by the summer of 1944, with the fall of Saipan and the fall of the Tojo cabinet and that. But it was then a question of whether Japan can avoid defeat and come out of the war with something other than surrender. Became the objective. And
Sure.
you know, he kept saying in the spring of 1945 that what they needed was one more sort of climactic battle that would inflict heavy casualties on the Americans and bring them to the conference, to the peace table, basically.
Sure.
And
well, that leads us into our next slide, and a question for you on that whole notion of war weariness. Do you think, or what's your assessment on the level of war weariness in America by summer of 1945? And did war weariness enter into the decision to drop the atomic bombs, especially after Okinawa?
Well, I'll answer the last one first. It didn't affect the decision to use the bombs because, as I said, Truman would have used the bombs when they became available to end the war. But knowing he had the bombs when he did made it a lot easier for Truman to continue to insist on unconditional surrender. The way I would put it. Now, as far as war weariness, that's another one of these big concerns that, and it becomes quite political on the home front. I mean, Hoover met with Republican senators, and they agreed that, you know, the Republicans could promote this idea of modifying unconditional surrender. They would have to do that carefully. They didn't want to be accused of appeasement, but they thought that there would be enough support in the United States for that, that Americans were already looking past Japan and towards peace, and that they were worried. I mean, they were tired of war. They were tired of the home front shortages. They were worried about the future. I mean, you know, the war had lifted the United States out of the Depression, but a lot, you know, that hung like a cloud over people's thinking about the future. What would happen once, you know, those 12 million soldiers in uniform came home? Would there be jobs for them? And then, of course, this raised that question of reconversion. There were a lot of people, business and labor leaders, but also within Truman's administration, who were arguing that the Army was just consuming too much of the materials available in the domestic economy and soaking up too much manpower to make a smooth transition to a peacetime economy. And they thought once Germany was defeated, then it was time to put that process in motion, to start thinking about moving to a peacetime economy. Well, General Marshall and the Army insisted that, you know, unconditional surrender required maintaining a large army and, you know, commanding large sectors of the economy. They wanted to throw everything they had at the Japanese, and that an invasion of Japan was going to be a long and bloody affair. And they didn't want Americans to start, looking past that. They wanted to keep that in the front of people's thinking. So in a way, that kind of war weariness was not just a mood. I mean, it had a concrete impact in terms of fears about the economy and efforts by legislators to try and alter the way the Army was using manpower and materials, and finally, leading some people to say, look, if unconditional surrender is getting in the way of reconversion, maybe we need to alter, the policy of unconditional surrender. So that was another powerful factor that Truman had to deal with in trying to go on to that war aim.
And it was very interesting, Mark, when I read the book that, and I'm sure I don't have the details complete here, but there was this notion of where are we going to find all the shipping to get people from Europe to the Pacific theater, but also wasn't there some kind of rating system where the most experienced veteran troops, they were the ones who were going to go home first, and the least experienced troops were the ones that were going to be shipped over to invade Japan. Do I have that right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, that system had been chosen really by the GIs themselves. Interestingly, another Army historian said that, that the Army had treated GIs sort of like a political constituency. They polled and asked them, okay, how do you want to handle this question of demobilization? And the GIs thought this system of awarding points based on time in service, time in a combat theater, military valor, medals, that sort of thing, all, number of dependents at home. You got points for up to 3 children, none for the 4th or 5th child, but all these things, and so GIs in Europe could calculate the number of points they accumulated when Germany surrendered, because that's when that process swung into action. But it was also included, and MacArthur insisted it also included soldiers in the Pacific. So that complicated it further.
Sure. All right, we have an additional slide on the atomic bomb. I'm not sure which one this is, which of those is, I can't recall. But let's switch real quick to our next slide. And there was an individual that was involved in the decision making and the politics of everything, which is something he was kind of known for. And so I wanted to ask you about your old friend, General Douglas MacArthur, who most folks who study World War II and American military history know seemed like not only larger than life figure, but also almost more than just a military officer, almost more than just a general. So, but tell us your findings. How did MacArthur factor into this? Because there's no way anything big happened in the Pacific without MacArthur having something to do with it.
Yeah, and here's where things got really political. Of course, at the time of Yalta, when the Americans secured Russian entry into the war, MacArthur was briefed on that. And in fact, he had even before that said that the Americans should be willing to make concessions to the Russians in Manchuria in order to get their involvement in the war. And several members of the Army staff visited the general, and he said the same thing to them. Well, unconditional surrender became very controversial once the war ended, because critics of the policy argued that if Truman had modified unconditional surrender, then the Russians wouldn't have overrun Manchuria, and would not have been in a position to help the Chinese communists. So the argument, this was part of that Republican argument that the Democrats, Roosevelt and Truman lost China. And MacArthur said, well, I never wanted the Russians in, you know. And in fact, a reporter for the Republican Chicago Tribune said that MacArthur at the time of Yalta had sent Roosevelt a report saying that the Japanese were ready to surrender and that the emperor was willing to make himself a figurehead for the. Now, this is a completely bogus report, and no one's ever found it, never existed. People close to MacArthur said they never saw it, and it's just completely fabricated. But ultimately, MacArthur says, yeah, you know, I was telling them all along that we didn't need the Russians in the war, you know. And then the Army, which had records of all of this, and Louis Morton, who was one of the Army's top historians, this information and showed that MacArthur was, I mean, D. Clayton James, one of MacArthur's biographers, who's fairly sympathetic to MacArthur, just says, I mean, MacArthur flat out lied about this, right? But interesting thing is that story keeps hanging around. It repeated in the 1950s, and most recently in Oliver Stone's documentary, you know, this sort of the unknown history of America in the 20th century, something like that. He cites Douglas MacArthur, you know, as saying, well, we didn't need the atomic bomb because the Japanese were ready to surrender. The general just won't fade away. He keeps
well, a couple more questions. During your research and writing on this book, did anything come up that surprised you, or was something that was unexpected?
Yeah, quite a few things. I mean, and that's sort of what is exciting about this kind of work. You know, you're never really quite sure what you're going to find in that next folder, that next level box, and you know, you might see something that other people have looked at, but they were asking different questions, and so they missed what you found interesting. So a couple of things that I found interesting was how many people involved in the upper levels of the government sort of either fabricated or misremembered their position towards unconditional surrender during the war. It turns out, you know, a lot of people who say that, well, they, for example, one of the people I cite is General Charles Bonesteel, who was a colonel at the time. And he later said in an oral history, and he told another historian that, you know, there were serious questions from a common sense point of view about unconditional surrender, and we didn't think much of the idea. Well, that's not what he said in the summer of 1945. And John McCloy, the Assistant Secretary of War, sort of created this story about him telling Truman in an important meeting, you know, that we ought to have our heads examined if we don't let him keep the Mikado. And he said that, well, Truman charged him with writing this, what became the Potsdam Proclamation. And in fact, there's no evidence for that either. And people like MacArthur and Eugene Duman, who was a Japan specialist, who you know, testified before these congressional committees condemning the supporters of unconditional surrender. He said those people, they were, you know, communist sympathizers. They wanted to promote revolution in Japan. That's why they wanted to get rid of the emperor. And his recollection of events is flawed as well.
Sure.
So that was one of the things that surprised me. Another was the sort of afterlife of unconditional surrender.
Mm.
I mean, it was a politically controversial policy because in effect it meant extending a New Deal-like operation, overseas into Japan. I mean, creating a more democratic society out of the occupation. And understandably, there were a lot of conservatives, mostly in the Republican Party, who opposed that idea.
Mm.
But what surprised me was the extent to which, there was this sort of cottage industry of people condemning unconditional surrender and writing about it as if it was some kind of a conspiracy. Herbert Hoover is one of them who says, it was the leftists and communist sympathizers in the American government who were people like Owen Lattimore, right, who becomes famous during the McCarthy era, is alleged to have been a spy and such. And they identify those people and say, well, they were really doing, Russia's bidding by prolonging the war. And the histories themselves aren't very persuasive on that score, but it kept this argument alive until the 1960s, when the sides completely reversed their positions. And as a lot of people are probably aware, it's the sort of left liberal revisionists who argue that Japan, by the 1960s, that Japan would have surrendered if Truman had modified unconditional surrender, and he didn't do that because he wanted to use the atomic bomb against the Russians. And of course, it's conservatives who then condemn that argument, basically say that's anti-American, and that continues to the this highly controversial Smithsonian exhibit, the Enola Gay exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes part of the culture wars, and conservatives are arguing that all these left-wing historians have sort of taken over the exhibit because they're saying outlandish things like, well, the Japanese were ready to surrender, or maybe they could have been induced to surrender, and they say that's
right.
Sense. Well, of course, that's exactly what American conservatives were saying in the summer of 1945. And American liberals and the sort of left wing of the Democratic Party, they condemned any thought of compromising with Japan. So they had completely reversed positions by the 1960s. And that was
interesting.
Yeah, that was a surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, my last question, this Unconditional has received very, very positive reviews in both the newspapers and journals, and it's a great, very interesting story to me. You've won the Bancroft Prize. Now you've gotten to be interviewed by me. Those are some of the highlights of your career, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what happens next? What are you working on now that we can expect down the road?
Well, I have in sequence. I'm doing actually with a colleague, a former colleague. He was a Japanese instructor here, professor at Villanova. We're doing a family history of this prominent family, the Irwins. They're actually descended from Benjamin Franklin, but they're Japanese American. And Robert Irwin was a prominent businessman in Meiji era Japan, and his granddaughter was came back to the United States. Her name's Yukiko Irwin, and she's here around the time of the American Bicentennial, and an interesting family saga that allows us to look at U.S.-Japan relations over the course of the 150 years or so. And so that's what we're working on. And after that, I'd like to do a sort of professional biography of General Albert Wedemeyer, who ultimately he was the commanding general in the China theater. He was, sort of handpicked by Marshall. He was, considered to be a quite an astute strategic thinker, but he was also a highly political figure in the way that MacArthur was. And,
sure.
And so I think there's a lot there to work with. And so
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Marc Gallicchio, author of Unconditional, The Japanese Surrender in World War II. Thank you very much for being here with us. We're honored to have you. And congratulations on the success of the book. And again, thanks very much for your time today. And we appreciate it.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks a lot, John.
Great. Have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Bye.